Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, it seems to some that we've found the answer to the question, who was the man responsible for the Colorado shooting at King Soopers in Boulder, and a lot of people think that now that we know his name, we know who it is. So, who is the shooter? Well, his name's Ahmad Al Aliwi Alissa. Oh, so now we know who it is. Of course, all that means is we know his name. And I do think this is where you draw the distinction between true crime rocket science and other things. Things like, nonsense, some sense, and, other things. So a couple of things I want to mention is I thought that the suspect looked quite swarthy, and I also was quite surprised that he seemed quite overweight. He seemed, just from the fuzzy photo, he certainly seemed older than a lot of the other shooters that we deal with. Adam Lanza was, I think, still a teenager, but a lot of the shooters are young, and this guy has a bald patch on the top. When you see him from the above view, he looks a lot more out of shape than a lot of those other shooters who seem skinny by comparison. And, I think perhaps subconsciously some people thought, he could be Muslim based on his swarthiness. But of course, because he's not wearing a shirt, if you look at his chest, he also does look like he could be white, just because what you see, it does look like a kind of a white skin. I've certainly felt, I don't know if it's a good thing to start pontificating about nationality before we even know the shooter's name and identity. And it is a very dangerous thing. But what I do find quite interesting is people have already started talking about, some people have called the whole thing a false flag or something, and that all the people who died are actors and don't believe CNN. And you sort of wonder where these people get the information. If they don't get it from CNN, where do you get it from? And I don't expect them to pay any attention to what I'm saying, but I do wonder, you have people looking at this guy, and some people think it's fake, the whole thing isn't even real. And those who don't think that think, well, it immediately goes down the path of, Fox News is going to jump all over this or something else. And in other words, they completely dodge the whole question, who is this guy? In other words, don't we want to find out why this crime happened? Or do we want to rush to politicize it? So in other words, I want to make it about all white men, or I want to make it about Republicans, or I want to make it about conspiracies, or whatever it is. And what no one seems to want to do is go to the trouble to find out who this guy is, to find out why did he want to do what he wanted to do. And if you're going to talk about him being antisocial, and we will in a moment, if you want to talk about him being having these like mental disease or paranoid or whatever, a mental disorder, I don't know whether he's so different from a lot of other people out there. People who jump to conclusions and simply choose the reality that suits them. Because I can tell you now how law enforcement works and how the law works is you take this guy into custody and then you try and find out who he is. And how you find out is you question him directly. You find out if he's got a criminal record. You find out what his background was. You find out from his family what is going on. And through all of that, you try and figure out a motive. You don't jump onto the train that is leaving the station. Oh, I wonder what Fox News is going to say because it's a Muslim. Or I wonder all of that stuff, right? And what I would like those in the true crime rocket science community to steer clear of that kind of banter. It's just not helpful. You want to maintain a calm mind, a kind of a quiet mind, a sensible mind, and a logical mind. I think the best way to approach this sort of thing is to imagine you are Spock and you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, let's try and figure this out, but let's do it unemotionally. Let's do it without jumping to conclusions and being triggered. Let's try and let the information speak for itself. And it applies to shootings just as it applies to any high-profile crime. But what I do think this tends to show is if you can do this about a case like this, the Boulder shootings, you can do it about everything. And you probably are doing it about everything. So something that you come across in the news or in your environment suddenly becomes, well, whatever you decide it is. But that's not reality. So I'm getting this information from the Denver Post, and what better source is there than a Colorado-based source? And it has surprised some people that this guy's 21 years old. He does look older than 21. I agree with that. I had a friend at school who, I think at about 16 years old, he was already shaving and was already suffering from male pattern baldness, probably at 18 or 19 years old. So it does happen. You get some people that are just swarthy like that. And so this guy does look pretty old for his age. He looks overweight for his age. He looks older than he is. Someone criticized me for saying that I thought he looked late 20s, early 30s. Well, that's what he looked like. So if you say he's actually 21 years old, am I wrong, or am I right to say, well, he looks like he's older than he actually is? So when we go into his background, we find out that there is a precedent. It's not surprising, really, that there's some psychological disturbance going on some way back. He previously attacked a classmate at Arvada West High School. That's according to court records and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Of course, Arvada is kind of an area where Nicole Kessinger sort of hung out. I think her parents sort of stayed in that sort of area as well. That was also where the FBI interviewed her on the Wednesday, at around about the same time Chris Watts was doing his polygraph. I've heard some people saying on Twitter and elsewhere that Arvada is a very conservative area. I'm not quite sure what that means. Is it conservative in terms of just everyone who lives there? Is it conservative because there's certain cultural things going on there? Are there certain people who live there which makes it conservative? I'm not quite sure what it means. Or is it just generally conservative? About 4 years ago, in 2017, when Alissa was 18, he attacked a classmate at school, and this led to an affidavit being filed. Apparently, he punched the guy in the head without there's no sign that he was going to do it. He just suddenly snapped, I guess. And when his classmate fell to the ground, Alissa continued punching him. You kind of get the idea that it was a frenzy, and nothing was going to hold him back, right? His classmate suffered cuts to the head and bruises, and it was obviously serious enough for it to lead to some kind of intervention. Witnesses told police then that they didn't know why the attack had happened. I don't know whether that's always a good thing when you hear that kind of thing, because you can have the friends of the classmate saying, I've got no idea why he did this. I would imagine that Alissa felt aggrieved, whether because of a real reason or a perceived reason by the person that he was. So more than likely, the fellow that he attacked had probably said something, made some kind of comment, and it wasn't the first time. So to say that they can't think of any reason, well, that's a possible reason. I mean, why do high school kids fight? And so in the very next line, and I haven't actually even read there yet, Alissa told officers that the classmate had made fun of him and called him racial names weeks earlier, right? So perhaps no one else in the class could remember that, perhaps no one else in the class could think of that, but of course Alissa would remember it because it was directed at him. And this often happens with school shootings. You will have people saying, I don't know why this happened, we didn't do anything, or whatever. But when you go to the shooter himself, he will say, well, I was humiliated or whatever. I'm not saying whatever he did is justified. I'm saying that there was something that was aggravating the situation. And to not acknowledge that is disingenuous. To not acknowledge that is a bit schizophrenic. It's kind of pretending that everything is perfect, and that is what creates these problems in the first place. Trying to sell a fairy tale to cover a lie. And so it does make sense. He's got a very unusual name for someone who's staying in America. He's got a very unusual name, and you can imagine with all the things that are going on in the world politically, that some kids would cotton on to his culture, and they did, clearly. You can also imagine that he would be, if he was outnumbered by white kids, that he would be quite sensitive to that kind of thing, which is not necessarily a good thing. He was convicted of misdemeanor assault in 2018 and sentenced to 2 months of probation and 48 hours of community service. This is based on the article in the Denver Post. Then there's a guy called Dave Snelling from the Arvada Police Department. He's a detective. He confirmed today that the local department had at least 2 interactions with the shooter over the past several years, and that included a case of criminal mischief. So you get a sense that he was troubled, right? You get a sense that he wasn't comfortable in his life. And what I do think is quite interesting is that he didn't commit suicide. So he was obviously angry, but not to the point of depression and hopelessness. And one wonders what happened over the weekend that prompted him to go out on the Monday. One wonders just what was going on leading up to the events that played out on the Monday afternoon. One would also wonder what happened on Monday. The Denver Post states that the details of the case that involved criminal mischief aren't available. The detective would also not say whether local police received any warning or complaints about Alissa from neighbors or from other people, but they deferred that question to the FBI. Now, as always happens, when this happens, everyone rushes to the suspect's social media, and then it's almost like no surprise, well, this guy wasn't very happy. Something that I think is so obvious but it's sort of often missed with these mass shootings is the perpetrator tends to not be very physically attractive. He tends to be small, a wimp, struggling to assert himself amongst his peers. His grades may be struggling. He may have just broken up. But you basically get a sense of a male individual who's struggling to individuate, who's struggling to find his place in society. That might be the society of high school, the society of university, such as the Virginia Tech killer Cho, the society of, and also the Isla Vista killer, Elliot Rodger, or also sort of early on in life. The Aurora shooter was also struggling kind of at the university level. And you had the same thing with Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, who I think at the time that the shootings happened, he wasn't doing very well in his grades. So, it was like, well, I'm failing anyway. I might as well, do something else kind of thing. The Denver Post also reveals that a Facebook page that apparently belonged to Alissa, he'd said in 2019 that he believed his former high school was hacking his cell phone. And so this is where you get a sense of paranoia. Did the paranoia come from, where did the paranoia come from? Did the paranoia come from what he was reading on Facebook? Did the paranoia come from substances? Did the paranoia come from a combination of what he was reading online and substances? Did the paranoia, where did it come from? Did the paranoia come from being alone a lot? And I think that is almost certainly going to be the case. Just any young person who's ostracized, who's pushed to the periphery, is going to have a sense of disquiet, and that is going to manifest in a particular way. They're either going to become, try and attempt to ingratiate themselves with a group and be rejected, and this is going to lead to them acting out and being antisocial, or they're going to find some kind of mission in which to sort of identify themselves, to prove themselves, right? He commented that someone asked why the school would do that, and he blamed racism. So you get the idea that this guy's got a chip on his shoulder. Now, it's easy for you or me to say that, or to be dismissive about that, to be dismissive about the racism thing. But when you look at this guy, he's got this beard, if he is 21 years old, he's quite overweight. His appearance is definitely something that's quite striking. If he lived in certain other countries, he might fit right in. But in the community he lived in, obviously, some people found his appearance novel, and novel to the point that it either offended them or amused them or intimidated them or did something to them. And this guy felt that. He felt that he didn't feel comfortable. And in any event, he responded, "I believe part racism for sure. I believe someone spread rumors about me which are false, and maybe that set it off." And so if you think about that, this idea that someone is whispering behind your back and someone is whispering things that aren't true, it plays into that whole narrative of fake news and what can you trust, and be paranoid because you can't trust the mainstream media. And more people are falling into that trap of, for example, the coronavirus. How many people thought it was a hoax? How many people still think it is a hoax? How many people thought wearing a mask is a political act? How many people still think that? And there's certain things where you can believe the wrong thing and nothing's really going to happen. But in some cases, you can believe the wrong thing and you go down a road, and the end of that road is King Soopers. And so I suggested in my first video that the fact that people were queuing for coronavirus vaccinations in the King Soopers supermarket, I didn't think that was just a coincidence. And someone corrected me and said, well, do you know, they were queuing at the back or something like that. The vaccinations were happening at the back, and he entered the supermarket and just started shooting. Well, there may be a link to that. I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm simply saying there's a little bit of reinforcement to that based on the very last sentence in this Denver Post article, which I'll put a link to in the description. He said on Facebook that he was worried about too much government control, and one wonders what his position was on something like vaccinations, and one wonders what he felt was going on with all these lockdowns, whether he felt like he's living in a society. Bear in mind, it's totally different if you live in a society where you're a citizen and you're accepted, and your government is telling you to do things you don't really like or want. That's one thing. But can you imagine living in a society where you don't really respect the government doesn't seem to respect you, the citizens don't seem to respect you, and they're controlling you, and they're telling you what to do, and you suspect that it's probably not true, and you suspect that there's a lot of government intervention. And not that long ago, there were some pretty hectic protests against the police in, I think it was Boulder. Was it Boulder or Denver? But that area, I remember being just surprised at the level of anti-police sentiment. And I wonder whether this incident is something that wasn't awakened already during those early protests. Do you remember those that I was talking about? Now, what's interesting, and this was reported in the Daily Beast, the suspect's brother, this is always interesting insight when you hear from the family members and close friends, the parents. Anyway, in this instance, the suspect's brother, Ali Aliwi Alissa, told the Daily Beast that his brother was very antisocial and paranoid, right? And so that is quite a statement from his own sibling. And so you get the sense that he was a loner, that he was either he felt rejected by society, or he was rejected by society, or both. And in that place of being lonely, it's easy to feel paranoid. When you're alone a lot, I mean, I can tell you as a writer, sometimes when I'm completely alone here, and I don't want to be disturbed, and people don't come around, you sometimes wonder whether you're hearing noises sometimes. Some of that paranoia is absolutely natural. But when the paranoia, if you're not used to being alone, if you're not used to, and in fact you're desperate not to be alone, but you can't avoid being alone, that paranoia is even worse. And so the Boulder County District Attorney, Michael Doherty, has said that they haven't pinpointed motive, but I don't think it's very hard to find. It is a perceived sense of being humiliated. It's a perceived sense of his person being infringed on, a sense that he's suffering a social death in some way. And we already have felt that from his university days, his school days, high school days. We get the sense that he probably felt a bit insecure, felt a bit inadequate, and the lack of social, I don't want to say social skills, but probably social skills as well, but the lack of perhaps social credibility, the lack of being taken up in society, made him more vulnerable to paranoia and also racism. It would be interesting to know what his brother said. Did his brother experience racism? Did his brother feel rejected by his classmates? How did he deal with that? How were the brothers different? Why did the one brother feel perhaps socialized and the other not? It would be very interesting to know that. I did hear some people saying that they heard different sounds when they were shooting, a pop and a different sound, a crack, I guess, and leading them to speculate that there was more than one shooter. I've also heard, different versions of how the shooting happened. It does sound to me as though there was a semi-automatic used. I did listen to some of the audio of the actual shooting, and to me it sounds like rapid gunfire. So to me the motive is already quite clear. It's a young man who was feeling his own sense of insignificance and felt almost a sense of panic, a sense of desperation, a sense of almost being attacked from the outside, and his only way of defending himself was to unleash in the way that he did. This is to some extent push back the physical world, actual people, but also in a way to assert his power. In a weird way, it's actually him asserting his lack of power. But that is the psychology in this case. It's the same psychology in every mass shooting case. In every mass shooting case, they say we're not sure what the motive is, and in every mass shooting case, the motive is the same. It's the search for significance in the face of feeling insignificant, feeling humiliated, feeling impinged. And what I think always happens in these cases is those who have been throwing stones suddenly don't say anything. When it comes time to say, so, you know what, I was actually insulting this guy, I was making fun of him, I was doing this, I was doing that, well, you never hear from those people. And I think that is quite an interesting question. Why do you think those people don't say anything? Do you think they feel responsible? Do you think they should feel responsible? Do you think they are responsible? Who do you think is responsible? Do you think the shooter alone is responsible? Do you think the shooter became what he became out of a vacuum? Do you think mental illness is the only explanation? Do you think if he is assessed by some kind of psychologist that is going to be found mentally ill? Well, wasn't he mentally ill before? Well, why was he not admitted to some kind of institution then? Didn't his family find him mentally ill? So is mental illness a sufficient explanation? And I think mental illness is happening, but I also think there's mental illness in society. And I think the way society responds to these incidents says far more about society than it says about this perpetrator. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.